Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, Canadian fighter jets are set to begin airstrikes against ISIL in Syria. So will this make the situation for Syrians better or worse? So we love to bring you underreported stories here on the stream, and we had a surprise when Malika Bilal started digging around the online community. The surprise was what, Malika?
Well, this is definitely a story that's flying under the radar for a lot of people, and that includes people in Canada. So of course that was a surprise. So we got a tweet like this. This is from Chantal out of Ontario, and she says, "I'm from Canada. I consider myself to be informed, and I didn't know this was happening." And I know Chantal's not the only one. So we want those of you at home to join this conversation as well. Just use hashtag AJStream.
My name is Amr Kauji. I love Syria, and I'm in the stream.
Canadian lawmakers have approved government plans to launch airstrikes against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in Syria. This is an expansion of Canada's involvement in US-led bombing campaigns already taking place against ISIL in Iraq under Operation Impact. The Conservative majority government, led by Prime Minister Stephen Harper, says the airstrikes in Syria are legally justified and necessary, and that there is a moral obligation for Canada to do its part in fighting global terrorism. But opposition parties have been highly critical of this approach, with some arguing that it violates international law. Now, others say the government should refocus all its efforts on humanitarian missions instead of combat. So what impact will the Canadian government's approach have in Syria? To help us talk about this, we're joined by Faisal Al-Azam. He is director of the Syrian Canadian Council and the co-founder of the Syrian Kids Foundation. Ahmed Dani Ramadan is a Syrian journalist who recently moved to Canada. Gail Davidson is co-founder of the Lawyers Against the War group. And Carl Matthews, Senior Deputy Director at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University. Good to have you all here in the stream. Danny, for you, the conversation in Canada, you've just got to Canada, you are Syrian. What do you make of what's happening right now regarding these airstrikes, this debate?
To be honest, it's a very confusing situation for me. It's confusing for me to see the airstrikes solution taking over and over to a problem that's clearly not in the need of a military intervention. The problem in Syria is a humanitarian crisis. It needs humanitarian efforts. It needs organized and well thought of and future planning humanitarian efforts, not by any chance more airstrikes. And it's baffling for me when I look at people here talking about airstrikes, the country that they come from, and that I was there like a year ago or something. So it's weird for me to talk about striking just because ISIS is there, while ISIS is a mobile state that keeps moving around. So
Faisal, Danny is baffled. Can you maybe illuminate him somewhat about this approach that Canada is taking regarding Syria and ISIL?
Well, I partially agree with Danny, is that humanitarian aid or an increase is definitely needed. Last year, the UN asked for $5.9 billion and only 57% of that was met, which forced actually Lebanon to close its borders and require Syrians to have visas to enter into Lebanon, and the first time in the Lebanese Republic's history. However, I must say that I am a great advocate of protection civilian population. Last year alone, 76,000 civilians were killed, including 3,500 children. If you visit all the literature on Syria, since last year, the number is 200,000 casualties at least killed. This number is not going up because the UN has actually...
But how much of that
the
number
UN
is
actually has stopped killing... Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry to...
Yeah, what I'm saying is that even the UN has stopped counting the dead inside of Syria because it's extremely dangerous even for UN agencies to operate inside Syria, because you are crushed by two fascist forces right now controlling Syrian territory. And one entity, you have the Assad regime using its barrel bombs, which by the way have killed a Canadian citizen and a friend called Ali Mustafa from Toronto last year. And the other side, you have that other fascist entity which is called, or the so-called Islamic State, financing part of its operation.
Right, Faisal, take a breath, because Danny's trying to have a conversation with you. Danny, go ahead.
Sure.
I agree to all of that. I agree to all what you said. I agree that the Syrian regime and ISIS are two very vicious forces that are playing a huge role in harming civilians in Syria and actually in Iraq and in Lebanon. However, what I disagree with is weaponizing the country. You don't add more weapons to a crisis that's created by war. It's not logical for me to decide that this is the approach. When you think about ISIS, ISIS is a moving state. It started in Iraq, it moved to Syria, and it's willing to go back to Iraq or to move to Lebanon or go wherever it can go just to make sure that it survives. So striking it in Syria is not going to solve the problem. It's on the contrary, is going to just increase it. Since the start of the year in 2015, according to the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, there were over 4,000 civilians who died in Syria since just in the last 4 months. Now, do we want to add more to that by actually shelling ISIS locations that we are not 100% sure that they are there?
Danny and Faisal, just take a pause for a second. Yeah. I know you want to go back and forth. Just take a pause for a second, because I want to bring in some of the online community.
Right. Well, Danny and Faisal, they're hearing what you're saying. And of course, Faisal, our condolences to your friend that you mentioned that was killed. But there's a question here that I want to bring in. This is from Joe. He asks, what will they get out of it? And they, in this case, of course, is Canada. Is there no other option but to do an airstrike? So, Kyle, I'm going to direct that to you. What does Canada get out of airstriking ISIL?
Well, listen, I mean, I don't think the Canadian government is naive and that they think that bombing alone is going to solve the problem. But what they do see is that ISIS is a genocidal force that is not just killing civilians in Syria, but it's also aiming to wipe out all diversity in Iraq. And it's carried out attacks in Tunisia just 2 weeks ago. It's now in allegiance with Boko Haram in Nigeria. It's a much larger transnational movement. And I think that the Canadian government says, if we're going to really try to put it on the run or try to stop it from carrying out this genocide, we also have to target where its space is. And there are cases in this conflict where military force has saved civilians. There are 20,000 Yazidis that were saved by American Air Force when they were out in Mount Sinjar. They were targeted by the Americans, and the civilians were able to flee. Same thing in Kobani, in northern Syria. Air Force allowed the Kurds to regroup and retake the town from ISIS. So we have to actually admit that there are cases in which people owe their lives due to us targeting ISIS.
Kyle, let me show you something, show all of our guests something, and then you can perhaps help me out with this being a little bit on the confusing side. Have a look here. This is an infographic that was shared by Channel 4. And they've broken down some of Syria's rebel groups and some of the groups fighting on the ground. So we've got the Free Syrian Army, and then under the Islamic Front, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 groups that we know of right now. Under Al-Qaeda, we've got ISIS and Al-Nusra. There may well be more groups. Let's just say, if you look back here again, we take out ISIS out of the mix. So Canada, the various international coalitions are successful in getting ISIS off the ground in Syria. Look at all the other groups that are still there. What's the value of airstrikes, Carl?
Well, what I'm saying is that, yes, there are no good options now in Iraq. I think the international community should have responded years ago, but they were blocked by the UN Security Council by China and Russia.
Right.
But the truth is, ISIS is the largest group. There's over 20,000 foreign fighters that have joined ISIS, including over 100 Canadians that are there now carrying out mass atrocities.
Sure, that may well be debatable about the numbers. It's difficult to know the exact numbers, but you're feeling, okay, they're targeting the worst group. That's what you're saying. Let me just bring in Gail. Gail, it's good to be able to hear you again.
Could I just break in here for a moment, please?
Please do. Go ahead, Gail.
Yes, I'd like to go back to Danny's comments and then to Kyle's comments. I agree with Danny that you don't stop war by making war. You don't save people from physical violence by bombing them. And to go back to what Kyle said about saying that he could point to examples of people whose lives had been saved by bombing. Well, I'm sorry, Kyle. The law is that the use of force is prohibited, is strictly prohibited in international law and in Canadian law,
and the Genocide Convention?
except in two narrow circumstances. The two narrow circumstances are when there's under Section 51, in order to take action for self-defense, which doesn't apply here.
Gail, let me
and
just,
the second circumstance
Gail, Gail and Carl, let me just share with you.
When the use of force is authorized by the Security Council.
All right, Gail and Carl, let me just break into this back and forth between you for a moment. Gail, give me a moment here. This question came up by the opposition leader in Canada, and he put this legality point to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Here's his question. Here's Stephen Harper's response. Have a look at this.
To the Secretary General as required under Article 51 of the UN Charter and laid out their legal case for their planned intervention in Syria. Has the Prime Minister written to the United Nations laying out Canada's justification for their planned intervention in Syria?
Once again, Mr. Speaker, the government is pursuing this action on exactly the same legal basis as its allies. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure what point the leader of the NDP is ultimately making. If he is suggesting, Mr. Speaker, that there is any significant legal risk to lawyers from ISIL taking the government of Canada to court and winning. The government of Canada's view is that the chances of that, Mr. Speaker, are negligible. We are clearly.
That's Prime Minister Stephen Harper talking about the legality of these expansion of airstrikes from Iraq into Syria by Canadian forces. Malika, where do you want to take us next?
Legal or not, people seem to be focusing on the humanitarian aspect of this. Krista on Twitter says, if Western countries showed the same enthusiasm for aiding and resettling refugees from Syria as they do for airstrikes, she kind of puts a wistful spin on that. But there's another person in a video comment who says something similar. Faisal, I want you to have a listen to this video comment and let me know what you think.
I truly think that Canada should not send airstrikes to Syria to try and defeat ISIS. Canada has no clear objective in the mission. We don't know anything about the mission, how long it'll take our withdrawal. We have no details about what will or could happen, so we're repeating the same mistake that the US has done when going to Iraq and Afghanistan. I strongly believe that Canada should focus on a humanitarian mission. There are millions of Syrians who need help and are suffering, and yet barely any help is coming from Canada. So the first step that Canada could actually take is to help the refugees instead of wasting millions of dollars on a war that we know nothing about.
So Faisal, the comment was slightly misinformed. Canada has put forward $700 million in aid and has helped resettle about 10,000 refugees. But you have people in Canada who say all of that money should be focused on humanitarian issues. What do you say to that?
Well, I do agree that we should up our game in terms of refugee resettlement without a doubt and increase humanitarian aid. However, I reiterate the point, the root cause of the humanitarian disaster in Syria is this repression that's taking place in Syria. And as I said, these two fascist forces that have torn Syria into parts. We have a great tradition in this country. And unfortunately, many people forget that, is that we were actually one of the drivers of the responsibility to protect convention. This question, when do we intervene when genocide is taking place? When do we intervene when a government is unable to protect its civilians from ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and genocide? And guess what? In Syria, the government is not only not able, the government is sponsoring the terrorism that is taking place.
All right, Faisal, just take a breath for a moment, because that's a really good question to ask our lawyer here on our lineup. When do you intervene in a situation as serious and chaotic as Syria, Gail?
The responsibility to protect, which is a controversial doctrine or principle in any case, but it is a tool by which states can intervene to restore or maintain world peace. It is not an authorization to commit war. Right. And with regard to Syria, Canada, I'm going to restrict myself to Canada, hasn't engaged in any non-violent attempts at finding a solution whatsoever. I just wanted to say that Syria's been under emergency measures provision since 1961, so it's not as if there's a whole fresh new problem in Syria that
so
hasn't
there's
been
the legal part
other than this current one caused by the West.
Sure.
But Canada hasn't asked the Security Council, for instance, to investigate and to make recommendations. Canada hasn't engaged in any kind of activity to try and restrict resources to ISIS, so to try and restrict the flow of armaments, the flow of food, the flow of water, their capacity to move around.
But you know that the bureaucracy of this could take a very, very
Canada
long
hasn't
time.
engaged in any diplomatic negotiations to say,
Gail,
well,
I hear your point. Let me go back to Danny, who's Syrian.
For?
And
no, but to have a bunch of us privileged people sitting around here saying, well, what could be the benefit of bombing in Syria is pretty obscene, really. The law says that the Syrian people are not allowed. We're not allowed to kill them. We're not allowed to bomb them.
Danny?
Because we have the
Gail,
idea
our
that
families
it might be
are there.
nice for them.
I'm Syrian as well. I'm giving the recommendation to protect civilian population while my family is there, and probably Danny's family is as well
my family
there.
is still there, and I'm telling you,
Danny,
hold
barrel bombing
on a minute,
should
Danny,
never
because I
be.
want to be able to hear you, and I can't while Faisal is finishing up. Faisal, finish up, and then we can hear from Danny.
The shock and awe campaign in Iraq was a humanitarian. It was billed as a humanitarian venture. Okay, so many years later, the best estimates say that over 1 million people died as a result of the U.S.-led invasion and occupation of Iraq. And
we have a Syrian
5 million people
and I
were
line
displaced.
Up. Gail, give me a moment here. Faisal, who's saying, I want you to bomb my country, Faisal, because?
No, this is not what I'm saying.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that there shouldn't be barrel bombing taking place daily indiscriminately at civilian populations. There shouldn't be airstrikes taking place indiscriminately at civilian populations on a daily basis. I actually agree with you, Dale. I was completely against the Iraq fiasco. However, you should go back and study how Bosniak Muslims were saved from ethnic cleansing in 1995, and go back to Kosovo and see how Albanian Kosovars as well were saved. So there are interventions and responsibility to protect that were applied very successfully, and I believe that this is what Syria needs right now.
All right, so
but Faisal,
Danny, go ahead.
Thank you. If I may, the idea of stopping the air strikes by the regime, the barrel bombs and the airstrikes that are daily, there are like thousands of them since 2015. I'm not going to bring out numbers. The idea is that means a no-flight zone. This is the military solution. If that's the military solution that is needed, this is what we have to do.
Or call it a no-kill zone.
Well, no-kill zone.
As well,
that
just call it a no-kill zone. There isn't 1 kilometer square where civilians are in safety in Syria. Not 1 kilometer square. Not for a humanitarian aid worker, not for a UN aid worker, not for a journalist, not for a civilian. Not 1 kilometer square are Syrians safe in Syria.
The point is, do we want to add more weapons? Do we want to add more attacks? If there's not a single, according to you, there's not a single kilometer that is safe, this is kind of not true, but some areas are safe. And to be honest, the way that the US managed to finally reduce the power of Al-Qaeda was through well-studied, well-structured, small-scale operations, not through airstrikes. Why are we doing mistakes that are clearly not going to lead to the results we want? Who are we, the ones that
Danny, I invite you to revise what happened in Kobani. I really advise you to revise what happened in Kobani, which I think was the only successful probably operation with Erbil that took place between Iraq and Syria.
All right, gentlemen, just give me a pause for a moment, because I just want to add in another comment from our online community. They're eager to have this conversation with you too, Malika.
Well, this seems to be the debate that's happening online too. So you have tweets like this from Ozzy, who says Canada should be focusing more on the humanitarian side and less on exacerbating the problem with the airstrikes. And then on the other hand, you have this person who says, it looks to be you can't have one without the other. It's a fog of war in Syria and in Iraq.
Right. Okay, Carl, this is an area that's your speciality. We're going back and forth with this, airstrikes, not airstrikes, airstrikes. How do you get to peace and peace for Syria via Canada's approach right now? Is it possible?
Well, you know, Gail mentioned things earlier that weren't true. Canada is very active in trying, in a working group, to stop foreign fighters from entering into Iraq and Syria. Canada's working on financing and trying to combat ISIS financing. We have a very large-scale approach to dealing with this problem. But when there are individuals with weapons that have stolen from the Iraqi army, that are killing minorities, we must stop this dreaming world that humanitarian aid will solve the problem. Military force is sometimes required to protect people or to get people to the bargaining table. And there are cases in Kobani where military action allowed locals on the ground, non-radicals, to defend themselves. This is not to be debated.
Yes, but that comes after 4 years of continuous attacks by the Syrian regime on the people. People cannot defend themselves at the moment.
I agree with you, but let's look at the problem.
Adding more strikes and singling out minorities is adding to the division in the country. When you talk about Syrians, I suggest that we talk about all of Syrians, and all of Syrians need at the moment more peace. There are almost 5 million Syrians who are outside of Syria at the moment, not by choice, including myself. There are thousands upon thousands, almost millions. I think I have the number here somewhere. It's like 6 million people.
I used to work for the UN High Commission for Refugees. I understand the plight of refugees. But if you want to prevent more displacement, you have to go to the source. You have to deal with the Assad regime, realizing that China and Russia are not going to budge on their veto power.
I completely agree.
And you also have to realize that a fanatical group has taken a power vacuum and is now threatening regions, not just Syria, but Iraq and other parts of the world. This is why it's so great and why Canada sees them as a real threat.
ISIS is a small power in this game.
Canada has no legal authorization to bomb in Syria. It doesn't matter what
the Genocide
Mr.
Convention
Harper says,
requires us to take action, and Kosovo in 1999
to take a breath for a moment.
I'm
you
sorry,
can tell everybody is very involved and deep into this debate.
There is no authorization.
Gail, we're going to take a pause for a moment. Take a breath, please. Gail and Danny and Carl and Faisal, we're taking you all to the post show, just as everybody is raring to go in that conversation. Hold those thoughts, please, everybody. Stream.aljazeera.com. We'll pick up in just a moment. But before we do that, here's Malika with some of the other stories we're following right here on the stream.
The hashtag #LetValentinaPlay is echoing across Toronto after the city's symphony orchestra canceled performances of a Ukrainian-born pianist. Valentina Lisitsa was let go for what she says were tweets against the current Ukrainian government. Well, in a statement, the orchestra's president said Lisitsa was replaced because of ongoing accusations of deeply offensive language by Ukrainian media outlets. Well, after the news, Lisitsa took to Facebook to ask for support, writing, "I was accused of inciting hatred on Twitter. I ask you to raise your voice and tell the symphony that music can't be silenced." Well, many answered her call. Andrea tweets, "A very unfortunate decision, banning Lisitsa for her views. Is it 1933 again? Learn from history." Well, next, we move to Nepal, where a Filipino domestic worker is climbing the Everest region's island peak in an effort to raise money for migrant workers in Hong Kong. 43-year-old Liza Avellino completed the first part of her 22-day trek on Tuesday after 2 years of saving enough money to make the trip. She's posting updates on Facebook and a fundraising page where she writes this: "I'd like to help others conquer a different type of mountain. I would like to raise funds to support Enrich, a charity that helps other migrant workers find the skills and the attitudes to find financial freedom." And finally, we want to know what issues matter to you. Got a story you think we should cover? Tweet hashtag AJStream and it could end up right here. Femi?
Thank you very much, Malika. Tomorrow's conversation, I'm really looking forward to it. It's a great conversation.
It is a good one.
Was not suggested by ourselves.
No, it was suggested by our online community because it comes with a hashtag.
All right, okay. So what will we be talking about? Well, tomorrow we'll be dealing with colonialism's legacy in South Africa, and we'll tell you why a student movement wants to rid the university campus of what they say are racist icons and statues. Big conversation for another day. See you soon. Thanks for watching. Hello, this is the Stream's online post show. We've been talking about Canada's decision to begin airstrikes against ISIL in Syria and the impact that this might have on the ground. Gail, I mean, you're not a prognosticator, but where do you think this might end? With Canada is going to go ahead with these airstrikes. They're going to expand the mission they have from Iraq into Syria. ... What could possibly happen next?
Well, obviously people will be killed, people who don't deserve to be killed, people who deserve to be protected by international law will be left unprotected simply because they're Syrians. This isn't happening in Canada. We're not authorizing the bombing of Canadians. We're authorizing the bombing of Syrians, and then there's collateral damage, and who cares? The fact of the matter is it's completely illegal what Canada is doing. When Canada went recently, last year when they Parliament voted to bomb Iraq, they were going on the slim thread of saying we were invited by the Iraqi government to come in here. That I didn't agree that gave them authorization, but that's what they were going on. And there was some,
and
they could make something of that argument. This time around,
Gail, can
Prime Minister Harper said in October.
Yeah, I just have a question. Does Dale believe
Prime Minister Harper said in October they wouldn't go into Syria unless they were invited by the Assad regime. Then just weeks ago he said, "Oh, I've changed my mind." Now we're going to go in and we're going to say it's self-defense, that we're defending Canada, which is a ludicrous and a silly notion. Like there's not a shred of evidence that would make that would trigger the
Gail,
right
allow
of
Faisal
Canada
to ask a question, because I like it when guests talk to each other. Faisal,
sorry, Faisal.
What did you want to?
I just have a question for Dale. So does Dale believe that the airstrikes taking place almost on a daily basis legal, that the Assad regime? And if she doesn't believe they are legal, how can we stop them? So she mentioned in the beginning talks of use of diplomacy. Well, we know that there are 2 Geneva Conventions. There are 11,000 people that we know of that are dead under torture. So I'd like to hear what is her solution to stop these massacres from taking place, and if she believes that these airstrike bombings are legal.
Gail.
Of the bombings by the Assad regime, you mean? Are they legal?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that your question?
That is the question. Yes, Gail.
Yes.
No, obviously they're not legal either. And your next question is, what is the solution? And the first thing I would say,
how do we stop
Faisal,
this
is
bombing?
anything but more
So Dale,
bombing.
how do we stop this bombing?
Anything
how do we
but
stop this bombing?
Well,
how do we stop this bombing that has this
everybody allow Gail to answer this, and then we'll move on. So Gail, Faisal said, how do we stop the bombing by the Assad administration on Syria?
Well, obviously you don't do that by more bombing. And you do that by looking at the arsenal of sorry for using the word arsenal, you're looking at the panoply of non-violent methods of resolving the dispute that have not yet been attempted.
Chemical weapons have been used, Dale, in Syria. Does non-violence work in front of sarin gas when the lungs of children are filled with sarin gas?
All right, so guess I feel that you're asking each other hypothetical questions going back and forth, and I hear the points you're making, and I understand where you're coming from.
I just want to say,
so I want to bring in some more community, Gail, if I may, because we have 5 people in the conversation. The 5th is our online community. So just give them a little space to join in. Malika.
Well, Gail did mention Assad and his regime, and so we have a question on that. This is a video comment, and Kyle, I'm going to give this one to you. Have a listen to what Alexander has to say.
By joining airstrikes in Syria, Canada enters into a part of the anti-ISIS mission, which remains undefined. Without an allied force on the ground able to take advantage of these airstrikes and roll back ISIS, the airstrikes themselves will largely benefit the Assad regime. At this point, it is probably smart for the Canadian government and Canadian military to continue their efforts in Iraq, after which ISIS has been rolled back in that country, to then reassess their priorities in Syria.
So Kyle, he says this could actually benefit Assad. Do you think that the plan is well thought out enough?
Well, the government hasn't revealed everything of what their strategy and their plan is, so I can't comment on that. But the notion that if we take action against ISIS, who don't respect national borders and are going back and forth between the Syrian and Iraqi border, which, yeah, the idea that if we took action against them, we're somehow strengthening Assad. I mean, when we took action against ISIS in Kobani, did the Syrian government rush in and take control of that part of the country? Of course they didn't. This is a false argument. I think we have to realize that, you know, we can take action against them.
They didn't, because we had partners on the ground.
Regime, but we have to deal with the Assad regime in a different manner.
I'm sorry, Kyle. I completely disagree with you. I can't trust on as a Syrian. I want to know that the crisis in my country is going to be solved. And for the last 4 or 5 years, we're talking about intervention to stop the Syrian regime, and nothing really happened. And then when ISIL started harming the international community and pushing the international community, that's the point where the international community decided to attack ISIS, not to solve the crisis in Syria, not to save Syrian lives, not to help Syrians get refugees or get education or become refugees, like stop being refugees, I'm sorry, or get education or get water or get. I lived in Lebanon as a refugee, and I went to refugee camps. I saw how people are starving to not just for food and water and shelter. They want their country to be better. And this is not what going to the airstrikes, more destruction, more bombing, more collateral damages. Thank you for who mentioned that. That's not going to help the country prosper. It's not going to make it a better country. You have 4 or 5 million refugees. This is a humongous number. I doubt that people are realizing how big this number is. There are 4 or 5 million refugees who live in Lebanon, Egypt, Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq. And those men and women and children their life is on hold for the last 4 years.
I'm going to ask all of the guests this, but starting with you as you bring this up, what is a better alternative then? I'm going to ask you to do this in a nutshell, because we don't have much time. And I want to ask everybody this, just very briefly though, what is a better alternative?
Airstrikes should be stopped altogether. No flight zone on the whole country of Syria. Limitations of the Assad regime powers. Limitations of its diplomatic support from Russia and China and all the other powers. And helping the refugees to settle back in Syria, around in the host communities, to settle back in Syria and to rebuild the country.
Let me move on to Kyle there. That was quite a to-do list there for you, Kyle. Is there a better alternative than airstrikes on ISIL right now?
I think one has to take action against ISIS because they're simply not confined to Syria. The UN came out last week saying ISIS is trying to commit a genocide against Yazidis. We have to realize that this is an exceptional case. The other issue too is that, you know, the world is very fearful now that that if we do anything strong against the Assad regime, they'll be toppled and be taken over by extremists, and those extremists are hostile to other countries. So there's a very delicate balance, but definitely we have to put more political pressure to get the regime, Assad's regime, to lay down their arms.
I'm going to move on, Kyle, because I just wanted to get an idea of other alternatives that you had thought about. Faisal, other alternatives, just very briefly?
I mean, the example of Kobani for myself is the perfect example, where you have both parallel action, where we had the YPG or Kurdish militias that were our partners on the ground. Right. And in parallel with these airstrikes, we're able to free Kobani from ISIS. And actually, it helped solve, in a sense, the refugee crisis, because a lot of refugees returned from Turkey into Kobani. And the same thing in Idlib. Although Idlib was controlled by what can be perceived as hard Islamist, a lot of refugees, and I'm extremely in touch in what's happening in the province of Hatay and Rihaniye, a lot of people went back into Idlib. So I come back always to that point, is that
and you made that very well. I'm going to push on because I've only left Gail 30 seconds, and that means that Gail has to come up with a good answer very briefly. Gail, we hear very clearly why you're anti the Canada's airstrikes on ISIL. Better alternative would be what?
I agree with the comments of Danny, absolutely, and Canada should start doing immediately all the non-violent things that it hasn't been doing. Canada's only accepted 1,300 Syrian refugees, for example. Canada hasn't engaged in negotiation. They may have engaged, as Kyle said, I didn't know this, in some efforts to stop the flow of arms, but a lot of the arms that the ISIS has are sold to Iraq by Canada in the first place. But they should be engaging in diplomacy, negotiation, sanctions, and humanitarian aid for Syria.
All right. Gail and Carl and Danny and Faisal, thank you for having this debate with us right here on the stream. Let me go one more time to the online community, see what they're saying.
I'll give you the voice from a Canadian tweeting us. Have we forgotten that fighting fire with fire is never the solution, Tomo says. This airstrike is not the Canada that I know of and live in, but as for alternatives, those aren't as clear.
All right, very interesting. All right, thank you very much to our guests for being on this edition of the stream. Let me tell you about what we'll be talking about next time. On the next show, dealing with colonialism's legacy in South Africa. We'll tell you why a student movement wants to rid their university campus of what they say are racist icons and statues. Thanks for watching. See you next time.